it's unfortunate, and that's what I'm saying. That, and this is not everyone within the party. You know. There are these tendencies, people driven by these materialist tendencies, who tend to do this. And unfortunately, some of them have been successful, and they get elected into leadership positions. Yeah, so I think that's how I would answer you on that.
Can I just ask, just for clarity, did you mean sheep as in sheep or
sheep like
so kind of suggesting that these are passive followers who just follow because someone is like that.
I'm saying, yeah, exactly. To some extent, it has worked. You know, financial exchanges happening and so forth. I talked to someone, and that's how they preferred. You know, there's a particular period during the conference where, you know,
actually, I have an observation, sort of question that I'd like to raise at least with you. It has to do. I mean, we have ideology involved here. The factions that you described earlier, the historical ones, were essentially around ideological issues. Now you're talking about divisions around much more material issues. So there's clearly been some kind of a shift. I'm not sure whether I would call it a shift towards neoliberalism. I grew up in Cape Town in the 1930s. No, sorry, I'm not that old. I grew up in Cape Town in the 1950s, and I remember my father saying to me, "You can never trust a city councillor." And I think a lot of what you may be talking about here has to do with the level of politics that's going on. We tend to talk about the ANC as though it's a whole, as though somehow whether you're an ANC city councillor or a member of the ANC cabinet, you're in the same box. In fact, I think there was a big difference between De Villiers Craft and Cape Town City Council. So I think that you need to at least consider the importance of the kind of the level at which you're talking. And then I think also it's very important to recognize, or it seems to me it's very important to recognize the level of poverty in this country and the extraordinarily high rate of unemployment, way higher than the official figures. And also that in many local communities, city councillors are better paid than anybody else. So these are plum positions. I mean, even more plum probably than the Cape Town City Council, although they did manage to tenderpreneur very nicely. But the level of unemployment, it seems to me, and it emerges from your material, is such that people say, look, I've got to get a job. And that brings me then to the question that Ben Scully raised, which is that these things are never. There's never a simple distinction between ideology and material interest. People operate within ideological parameters, maybe, but there's always an element of personal interest, and the other way. People pursue personal interest, but they pursue personal interest within a particular kind of common sense framework that they use in the way they see the world. So I mean, these are observations, but I very much like to get your take on it.
Okay. I mean, the last one, I'll take that as a comment. But the first one, I think it ties a lot to what the kind of questions that have been coming up in the exchanges we've been having here, Michael, Tsepo, and so on. I guess, and my comrade here, the issue of ideology within the ANC. I guess, I think I mentioned this in the presentation, that when I refer to Prof. Susan Boysen, I mentioned that this is the analysis of the national level. So this is what broadly people have been, the kind of analysis that they've been using of the ANC at the national level. But then I then shift my attention and say, look, this is debatable at the national, and I don't want to get into it. It might hold some weight, at the national level, the issue of ideology. But then I get into say, look, I'm looking at the local level, and I want to see what are the determinants at the local level. And I agree with you. That's where you see these issues of material. Maybe they're specific to that context, and they're driven by the kind of conditions that people live through, the unemployment and so forth, and the realization that being a councillor, you're bourgeois in this context. You're a councillor, but maybe in Central you're not. You're a councillor in Central, you're probably not bourgeois. But in this context, you really are. So. Yeah, I guess it's important, and maybe I should step it out a bit more, that it differs with the level that you analyze. And, yeah, okay, thank you so much.
Any other questions, observations?
Yes, my name is Mui Nawa, Department of Political Studies student. According to history, we know that democracy, one of its positive consequences is the liberation of civil society. It's possible now for individuals to achieve some things by themselves. And that's where in Europe we had industrial revolution, because the civil society is liberated too. And here in South Africa we've got a democratic dispensation, but still we are facing this situation wherein the state is the biggest employer, and the individuals are unable to achieve by themselves, which means the civil society is still emasculated. People cannot invent, people cannot take initiative for development. They are expecting for the government to do everything. So my question is, do you think that the democratic transition in this country has failed? And did you identify any factors that have contributed to the emasculation of the civil society in this country? If you will, what are they? And do you think there is hope, a real hope in this country for the civil society, for individuals to make a living, to succeed in life outside the state institutions? Thank you very much.
Did you have a question?
Yes, Eddie Webster from Kusamani Institute. Firstly, let me congratulate first Tatenda on his very coherent and clear presentation. I had two observations, Tatenda. The first is, I guess it builds partly on the point made by the previous speaker and also the point made by Dunbar Moody. I think the decisive shift is quite self-evident. It's the moment that the ANC becomes the governing party, it controls the state. And as you correctly pointed out, the state is the largest employer. And within a context where there's very high levels of unemployment. So the way to get access to a job is through the political party that happens to be the governing party. I agree that neoliberalism, through the whole process of tendering and individualism, does also shape that, but it's not 1996, then it would be 1994, when the ANC becomes the employer for the first time. And I think it also correct, somebody mentioned there was strong ideological politics in the 50s and 60s. Well, of course, that was a period when the ANC was driving in opposition, and ideas around the national question were central. I would focus on the point that the state is the strongest employer, particularly in the rural areas. But the other observation I had is, I think there was a slight misunderstanding by one of the speakers. You mentioned, and I think it's a very interesting example, you mentioned the PT, the Workers' Party in Brazil, where factions are institutionalized and are in the constitution, not the ANC. The ANC doesn't have factions in its constitution. It's the opposite. And I think the useful distinction that you touched on in the literature would be a distinction between degenerative factionism, which you mentioned just in passing, which I would develop further here. The ANC is an example of degenerative factionism, where factionism isn't really tolerated. And the PT Brazil is an example of a constructive, I forget the distinction the authors make, but let's just use the word, sorry? Cooperative, that's the word, thank you, Jacob. Cooperative factionism, where what you're saying to the people in the party, we can have different views, we can contest those views, their differences, the broad church, but you're not going to be expelled if you have those different views. In our constitution, you have the right to differ and to form a faction, and that faction can have its own newspaper, can have its own meetings, and you don't expel people or drive them up, like say happened with Coke or whatever. You allow for political tolerance, and I think that's the key question here. It requires quite a lot of, to have cooperative factions requires a lot of tolerance, and that's the distinction. I think you ought to maybe, Tatenda, it's a suggestion, maybe to foreground it a little bit more sharply. And in fact, I have a paper on comparing the PT and the ANC, which I should give you. Thank you.
Jacob had a question.
So rather, I would go on to your comments, Tatenda, when you say that you're looking for these things from the local perspective, which is great. But then, when you look at perhaps the layered way within which the elected conferences are done, from the local to the national, and taking into account factions are also avenues through which patronage networks work to some extent. Maybe, I'm just asking this case, do you see perhaps when this camp starts crystallizing at the local level all the way to the top of maybe backwards, how does that then eliminate possibilities of similarities between what is local and what is national?
Okay, I think Tatenda, this is your last chance, so you must finish up with a big bang now. We're talking about war politics here in the American term.
I guess the puzzle with these days is there's a good story to tell. And I don't think I will make sharp. I don't think I will end on that note. But anyway, Jacob, you make an interesting observation, and it's a dilemma, that I had to deal with, because you're definitely right. You're definitely right. You cannot talk of the local alone and separate to the provincial, national, and so forth. But again, just to turn it back again, I think there is some value to talking about the local in itself, especially the local in the sense that it's not necessarily a ward or a country or anything. It's a region. Kampala City is a region. It's just below the provincial. In my research, I have seen those elements of the links, So you, for instance, you get someone in the NEC, Lutuli House, but who's from that particular area, who's from Buffalo City. An individual who's got a company that is supplying signposts in the city. And this is someone who's at the national level. And those kind of individuals sort of have a say and influence what happens at the local. But then again, there are some organization, political organization that happens, that originates from the local, but then for it to sustain itself, it needs to have those links with someone in the provincial executive committee, for example, for it to sustain itself. So, I mean, it's a dilemma, and I don't know how to deal with it, but definitely it's something that I have to think about, focusing on the local, but I must, at least maybe in passing, draw the links, but indicate that, look, I'm focusing on the local. At this point, I'll take that as comments, and I'll definitely take you on that offer to send the article. And I mentioned it in passing, the issue of degenerative and cooperative factionalism. And I can think of other examples besides the PT, and I'm drawing on them in the paper. So the Christian Democratic Party in Italy at some point was also marked by factionalism, and there was a certain moment in time they were cooperative, then they became degenerative, and that led to them, falling apart. So I'm drawing on experiences of the PT, the CDP in Italy, and even the socialists in Japan at some point were marked by these issues. But I agree with you. I think I didn't foreground it as much as I should have, and yet that is the key to determine, or to put out the point across that, look, factions can be cooperative in some instances, but the form of factions that we're having here are degenerative because of such and such reasons and so forth. And how can we shift from this degenerative form to the cooperative form? I'll definitely foreground that a bit more.